The Rosaceae is one of the largest plant families in the world and is the family of the domestic ornamental rose that is so familiar to us all. In fact, the so-called English rose is not really English at all, but was probably developed by the Dutch from roses brought along the Silk Route from the Middle East. Those ornamental roses are far removed from the wild members of the rose family, which is far more diverse and interesting than the roses you would hurriedly buy from a garage forecourt for a forgotten anniversary. According to the Collins Wildflower Guide, the Rosaceae family has the fourth highest number of native species of all plant families in the UK. What surprised me was the range of common and familiar plants that I would never have imagined were in the same family as the rose. The Rosa genus, which includes dog roses and field roses, is obvious. But what I hadn't realised was that species range from grassland herbs like meadowsweet, to blackberries, to trees like apple and rowan, to strawberries and those pesky wood avens that I'm constantly trying to prevent from taking over my garden. I counted 22 different Rosaceae species in my 0.1 of a hectare back garden, some which I'd planted and some which had just arrived by themselves. There is a huge amount of information available on the Rosaceae, but sources vary and some are contradictory. Different sources present different versions of the rose family tree, each with slightly differing terminology. I have created a simplified version here after examining several sources. Britannica describes the taxonomy as contentious, and the BSBI handbook, Roses of Great Britain and Ireland, says that it has been the despair of systemists since the time of Linnaeus, due in part to their readiness to hybridize. Until the early 1900s, spirea, plum and apple were considered separate families until they were reclassified as Rosaceae, prompting this well-known poem by Robert Frost in 1928. Classifications of subfamilies vary from source to source. Britannica subdivides Rosaceae into 4 subfamilies defined by their fruits, whilst Potter et al. Combines 2 of them into one group. When it comes to identification, Collins' Wildflower Guide is a good standard for most species, and it simply divides the family into 25 genera found wild in the British Isles. Francis Rose's Wildflower Key is another reliable source. There are various online guides and websites for those determined to identify subspecies of bramble, and the BSBI Roses Handbook deals with the details of the Rosa genus, listing many of the numerous hybrids, but for most purposes, identifying the 12 native species listed in Collins should be sufficient. So with this huge variety of species, what do they have in common? Well, if you take a look at the flowers of many of the wild species, the similarity becomes obvious. Apart from the cultivated varieties, most have symmetrical flowers with 5 petals. They often have an epicalyx beneath the calyx, so that they look like they have 2 rings of sepals below the flower. They have 1 to many carpels and numerous stamens, creating the familiar fuzzy look in the centre of the flower. Just to confuse us though, sometimes the petals are all but absent, just leaving the calyx and the epicalyx to distinguish the flower, notably in the lady's mantle species. Even the 5 petals rule isn't guaranteed. Tormentil, a common plant of acid soils in upland areas of the UK, for no particular reason has only 4 petals, and Mountain Avens, as its Latin name suggests, has 8. It seems that even species that are supposed to have 5 petals don't always toe the line. Along a local lane, I came across this blackthorn tree in full bloom. It had typical Rosaceae flowers with 5 petals. Or so I thought, but on closer examination, I found one shoot with flowers with 9 or 10 petals. If you look at the centre of the 10-petal flower, you can see that there are actually 2 carpels, the female flower parts, whereas the 5-petal flower only has 1. Aha, I thought, I know what's going on here. They're a mutation, with 2 sets of chromosomes instead of 1, so they have twice the number of flower parts. I went to look at the blackthorn in my garden to see if it had any 10-petaled flowers. At first glance, it seemed to have nice normal flowers, but then I spotted this. The flower on the left has 7 petals. Others had 6 petals, but they only have 1 carpel. They're just not following the rules. So how do I even know my original sample was a blackthorn? Well, it's a small shrub, one of the first to flower in spring, with flowers appearing before the leaves on dark grey or black twigs. It's part of an old hedgerow. The flowers are small, white and symmetrical, and the leaves are the classic oval shape. It pays to have a look at the whole of the plant, its habitat and flowering time. Alternate leaves, almost always with stipules, are another characteristic feature, though even this isn't always obvious. At first glance, the leaves of a rose, like those on the cover of the BSBI guide, appear to be opposite because the leaves themselves are pinnate, consisting of 4 to 6 leaflets arranged opposite along the stem, with a single leaflet at the end. Others, like hawthorn, have a lobed but more obviously single leaf with stipules at the base, whereas blackthorn has a simple oval leaf and the stipules are not obvious. So why study one of the most common and widespread families in the UK? Shouldn't we be concentrating on the rare and the unusual? Unfortunately, as we know, that which was commonplace and unremarkable in years gone by can all too easily decline in the modern world. Whilst cultivated Rosaceae, such as apples, cherries and almonds, are hugely important food plants for humans, their wild cousins are the poor relations of hedgerow, scrub and wasteland. We only protect that which we value. And who values brambles and hawthorns in our margins and untidy corners? Well, the brimstone moth and 200 plus other species of insects and arachnids associated with hawthorn do, as well as the multitude of birds and mammals that enjoy the fruits of the hawthorn and the rowan. Wild roses matter to the rose chafer, the streamer, shoulder stripe and barred yellow moth caterpillars that feed on dog rose, and to numerous flies, gall wasps and leaf miners, including the gall wasp that makes the familiar robin's pincushion gall. We live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. All of nature is threatened, and the commonplace species on our doorsteps are an essential component of a wider ecosystem on which we all depend. Community involvement is vital to change attitudes, to slow down the destruction and the tidying up of our native wildlife. A great way to involve communities is to demonstrate the richness and importance of our hedgerows. Rosaceae are a fundamental component of hedgerow structure, providing varied niches at different heights and densities, and a continuous supply of nectar for pollinators from March right throughout the summer. As a child in suburban Manchester in the 1970s, foraging trips for blackberries, crabapples and rosehips, for jam, jelly and syrup were important annual events in my childhood, with juice-stained fingers, prickles and scratches connecting me with nature and the seasonal progression of the year. All children should be able to walk through a bramble patch and experience picking berries for themselves. The place of bramble in our ecology is complex. It can both help and hinder biodiversity, and its role is still not fully understood. In 2010, Harmer et al. Found that when clear felling took place in a beech woodland, a dense thicket of bramble sprung up, which protected willow and birch seedlings from browsing by deer, facilitating regeneration of the woodland. However, in an earlier study, they had found that bramble had an adverse effect on the survival of oak seedlings. As always in ecology, the devil is in the detail. It depends on whether the habitat is newly felled clearing, woodland edge or established glade, the tree species involved, the fauna, and possibly the subspecies of bramble itself, of which there are 320. Bramble has a long flowering season, and provides food for around 240 species of arthropods. Its flowers are an important nectar source to insects such as bees and butterflies. The peach blossom and buff arches moth caterpillars feed on its leaves, and numerous birds and mammals feed on its berries, including us. It provides habitat and shelter for numerous animals, including, remarkably, grass snakes. Nightingales, too, find protection from predators in bramble thickets. So although it is common, it provides a haven for the rare. And as we go about our everyday activities of tidying up the landscape, we don't want to suddenly find that we have cleared away so much that a habitat of fundamental importance has been fragmented and diminished to the point where it no longer provides for the species that depend on it. The Mammal Society found that for dormice, bramble was by far the most important shrub as a nesting plant, with a total of 42% of dormouse nests recorded in bramble. It's easy to see how a continuous network of brambles linking trees and shrubs together could provide a haven for an animal that needs to hide deep within the thicket and travel unseen from tree to tree, rarely descending to the ground. And bramble is also useful in solving murders. It's a vegetable calendar, with rootstock sending out 1 or 2 shoots a year, which fruit on the second year and then start to decline as they are overtopped by older stems. The amount of bramble growing over a body discovered in a thicket can be used to estimate the number of years that the unfortunate body has been lying there. Not all Rosaceae are common. The wild service tree is a rare indicator of ancient woodland. The leaves are a food source for moth caterpillars, and the Woodland Trust says the fruits were also known as checkers, are said to taste like dates, and were given to children as sweets. They can be made into an alcoholic drink, and it is thought that they influenced the naming of Checkers Inns. The shrubby trinquefoil is a vulnerable and near-threatened native plant. Whilst cultivars are common in gardens, the wild plant occurs naturally in just 2 areas of northern England. An even rarer species is the only native British cotoneaster, the critically endangered great ormberry, with only 6 original wild bushes left. A bat priority species, it is our only native cotoneaster. British gardens are awash with cotoneaster species, but all of them are introduced, mostly from the Himalayas and China. The great ormberry, however, occurs only on the limestone rocks on the 2 by 1 mile Great Orme Headland in Carnarvonshire, North Wales, and nowhere else in the world. Among the threats to these unique plants are highly invasive non-native cotoneasters escaped from gardens, and the beloved Great Orme Kashmiri goats of lockdown YouTube fame. Plant life is protecting the remaining wild bushes from the goats with metal cages. The Rosaceae include everything from delicate herbs to full-grown trees. They are essential for wildlife and as food crops the world over. They are particularly prevalent in the Northern Hemisphere, but they occur almost everywhere except for the Antarctic. From the Cherry Blossom Festival of Japan, to the apple harvest in Washington State, to Scottish raspberries, they are one of the most successful and important plant families.